Hako or Box of Goblins is a beautifully animated masterpiece by Studio Madhouse that takes into account the physical and the metaphorical aspect of boxes in this show. The story is set in 1952, where Japan is recovering post-World War II, and obviously it has its own devastating effects. This is where the old folklores are getting replaced by modernization. Now, because of the massive loss of life during the war, people start getting obsessed with the idea of immortality, so much so that some scientists actively during the war were trying to figure out if they could create immortal soldiers. It is during this time period that horrific crimes begin occurring, and you start finding severed limbs of young women appearing all over in the outskirt fields of Tokyo. To solve these bizarre crimes, a group of eccentric individuals gets dragged into solving the crime. They consist of Chuzenji, a Shinto priest who's very skeptical and tries to rely only on cold logic and facts, and he's honestly the best character on the show in my opinion. Followed by Sekiguchi, who's an author who writes a lot of murder mystery and often struggles with mental health illnesses. And ironically, this is what makes him a very good crime fiction writer. Third, we have Detective Kiba, a post-World War II veteran who suffers with PTSD, who doesn't get a lot of sleep because in case he does try to fall asleep, he starts getting flashbacks of the war, and this is what makes him very grumpy, and this is probably why he's not able to solve the case on time. Fourth one is Enokizu, the flamboyant private investigator who works with the Red Cross agency on this case. Now, this man is as eccentric as it gets because he also possesses a skill known as psychometry, which essentially allows him to see visions or emotions linked to an object or a person by touching them. Now, compared to your standard detective shows, Mouryo no Hako is very distinctive because it is very dialogue heavy. Instead of just relying on physical clues for finding the perpetrator to the serial killings that take place, this show also relies on heavy psychological clues to kind of suss out and understand the serial killer's mind. Now, every single word on this anime carries a lot of weight, whether it's escaping the mouth of a detective or it works as whispers in the background, because Mouryo no Hako simply refuses to handhold its audience and provide things on a silver platter. Rather, this show encourages critical thinking and forces you to pay attention. So in case you're a viewer who doesn't like dialogue heavy shows and just wants the crime solved, this show may not be for you. One of the prominent themes for the show is mental health, which manifests itself disturbingly through Yoriko and her emotionally unstable single mother. Yoriko's obsession with Kaneko stems from the fact of immortality, and this is because she views Kaneko as someone beautiful and immortal, and Yoriko's biggest fear for Kaneko is that Kaneko will one day grow old and ugly. Yoriko wishes for her body to never change, and this desire comes from the fact that Yoriko's mom makes handmade dolls based on Yoriko, and Yoriko as a teenager rightfully feels that her mom only views her as a doll. Yoriko and Kaneko form a deeply convoluted romanticized relationship where they talk about goddesses, angels, and the fact that they're even reincarnations of each other. They even delude themselves into thinking that dying together would be the ultimate romance. Now, the night these two girls try to run away, Kaneko gets pushed onto the railway track and leaving her in a very near fragile state. Now, under the stress of trauma, Yoriko's brain creates an alternate reality where a mysterious man happens to push Kaneko onto the tracks, and this is what I find very fascinating because Yoriko had just read Sekiguchi's latest novel on crime. She fabricates an entirely imaginary man, and this goes to show the extent to which our brains protect us from immense trauma. Following the accident, Yoriko's mom's paranoia spirals out of control, and this is where she becomes susceptible to superstition. And when Yoriko goes to tell her mom to unalive herself, this is where she believes her daughter Yoriko has been possessed by Mouryo or a goblin. Drowning and dead and completely lost in life, she falls victim to the false priest known as Onbako-sama, who tells her that the southeast corner of her house is unclean. Now, this is the sort of cult that literally drives families apart and therefore forces Yoriko's mom to not even let Yoriko inside. Sadly, Mrs. Kusumoto doesn't snap out of her delusions until it is too late, and Yoriko ends up getting murdered, and and when Kusumoto learns that her daughter has been murdered, she tries to unalive herself, but thankfully doesn't, because this is where Reijiro, the eccentric detective, steps in and talks her out of it. The anime spends a massive amount of time explaining what spiritualism is, and in episode 2 we see a mention of Torimono, basically a demon who latches onto unstable souls, driving them to murder. Episode 5 and 6 features Chuzenji explaining what clairvoyance is and rationally classifying espers, fortune tellers, priests, and mediums. Episode 7 and 10 talk about Chinese and Japanese mythology, and this is also a part where you see Chuzenji beautifully exposing the false priesthood of Onbako-sama. We talk about the central metaphor of what exactly is the box, and this anime does it in terrifying details. The first one is a physical box, which is essentially the wooden and the steel boxes where the severed limbs are found. The second one is the architecture, which is Dr. Mimasaka's lab, which, locals whisper that this is where Onbaka-sama uses to store evil spirits. The third one is a psychological box where Onbaka-sama explains that if you happen to build rigid emotional walls around you, you tend to harbor an evil spirit or a Mouryo or a goblin in this case, and that itself can be very dangerous. The fourth one is a human box, and this is where Detective Kiba views himself as an empty box because he's got no real goals in life. But when he happens to run into Yoko and Kaneko, he finally finds purpose because he wants to protect them. But in episode 4, when Detective Kiba gets kicked off the case, he views himself as an empty box because he knew Dr. Mimasaka from the war, and this kind of feels very personal for him at this point. We reach the final biological box because in episode 12 and 13 it is discussed that Dr. Mimasaka's lab houses human consciousness, which essentially means that he's able to keep a severed head alive just by hooking it up to wires. Ultimately, the show concludes that all human beings are goblins in a box because if the human mind is not nourished properly, it tends to turn into an evil spirit, and therefore we're trapped in nothing but a prison or a box. The final revelations of Mouryo no Hako leave us with a deeply unsettling feeling that Dr. Mimasaka's lab was indeed an epicenter for all the activity because he absolutely hated the idea of aging. His excuse was that initially he had opened this lab to find a cure for his sick middle-aged wife, but instead the reality was that he had grown entirely tired of her. Now, because he'd grown entirely tired of his wife, he happens to fall in love with his eldest daughter Yoko, or Yuzuki, and therefore while Yuzuki may have initiated the seduction, it was Dr. Mimasaka who went all the way through with her, and that resulted in her pregnancy, which means that Yuzuki and Kaneko are not sisters, but their mother and daughter biologically. Now, that was certainly a conclusion that I wasn't expecting through Mouryo no Hako when I was watching the show, and added to the twisted ending of the inbreeding that resulted in Kaneko, we finally discover the reason that Kubo went on that murder spree was because he was obsessed with this idea of pure beauty. Now, this is because he happened to witness the severed head of Kaneko in the hands of Amemiya inside a box, and that is where Kubo begins his twisted journey of going on a murder spree, severing the limbs of the girls that he came across in an attempt to try to keep them alive in boxes. Ironically, when Kubo approaches Dr. Mimasaka with his dark obsession, Dr. Mimasaka turns Kubo into an experiment, and by the time the group reaches the research facility of Dr. Mimasaka, Kubo has already been turned into a severed head that is being kept alive by wires. Now, Dr. Aoki tries to arrest Dr. Mimasaka, but in a panic, Mimasaka tries to flee with Yoko, and in one last-ditch attempt, the severed head of Kubo ends up biting the jugular vein of Dr. Mimasaka, ending the doctor on the spot. Now, where do these turn of events leave Yoko? Now, obviously, because Yoko's lover slash father have been killed, Yoko goes mad with grief, takes a weapon, hammers Kubo's severed head out, and practically murders him. And because this entire scene took in place and in front of the police, Yoko finally gets arrested. The aftermath is that the goblins finally get exorcised, Yoko gets arrested for the crime, and obviously she is heartbroken and shattered because all of her family secrets come to the forefront. And this brings us to a sad but satisfying conclusion to Mouryo no Hako. Were you able to figure out the ending to Mouryo no Hako while you were watching it? Let me know what your thoughts are about the show. Until next time.